Imagine a nation legally required to anchor its entire calendar and its economy to the absolute most traumatic, brutal moment in its history.
Right, a nation that actually mandates a yearly sensory replay of their lowest point.
Exactly. And that is exactly what ancient Israel did. Welcome to our deep dive, everyone. Whether you're listening on your commute or, while making coffee or just taking a well-deserved break, I want to start by offering a sincere, divine blessing for your day and for your entire week ahead. May you find peace, clarity, and purpose in whatever you are setting out to do today.
That is a wonderful foundation to start from, and clarity is really what we are aiming for as we examine some deeply embedded historical texts today.
Yeah, we're diving into ancient history, but we're looking for the mechanisms behind the history. Specifically, we're exploring the ancient blueprints of memory, society, and justice found in Deuteronomy chapter 16.
It's such a dense chapter.
It really is. And to unpack this, we're using the comprehensive study notes from two major sources. We have the Holman Study Bible and the NWA, that's the Nova Almeida Atchlazada Study Bible.
Right, two very solid frameworks.
And as always, we're looking at this impartially to understand the architecture of an ancient society and, the profound theological ideas that held it together.
The concept of architecture really frames this perfectly, because when you look at Deuteronomy 16 through the lens of these study Bibles, you realize this isn't just like a random assortment of ancient rules.
Right.
It's actually a structural masterclass on how a society actively prevents itself from forgetting its roots. It outlines a mandatory physical, communal rhythm of life.
Yeah, we're talking about three major pilgrimage festivals that are intricately tied to some pretty uncompromising civic laws.
Let's start with that rhythm.
Yeah, because before a society can function fairly in the present day, it has to have a shared memory of where it came from. And the way the ancient Israelites approached this is honestly kind of wild when you think about it in modern terms.
Oh, so?
Well, they didn't start their national calendar with a story of a great military conquest or, a golden age of unprecedented wealth. They started it with their slavery and their subsequent liberation from it.
Yeah, they anchored their entire identity to trauma and deliverance. The first major event on their calendar is Passover, and the NAA notes point out the specific timing here. It happens in the month of Abib, which translates literally to ear of grain.
So early spring.
Right, so we're talking about the very start of spring, which corresponds to our March or April. And this marks the historical anniversary of the Exodus liberation from Egypt.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is what always confuses me. If you are celebrating the fact that you are no longer slaves, why would the text command you to eat what it explicitly calls the bread of affliction?
It seems counterintuitive.
Totally. Why force an entire population to eat unleavened bread, this dry, flat, dense reminder of suffering for 7 whole days? Like, if I'm throwing a party for my freedom, I want the richest, most luxurious feast possible to prove that I'm free,
Yeah, I get that. But a luxurious feast would only celebrate the present. It wouldn't force you to remember the past. Unleavened bread is actually a brilliant psychological and sensory mechanism. What's fascinating here is that you have to remember the context of their escape.
Right, the Egyptian army.
Exactly. They were literally running for their lives. The Egyptian army was right behind them. The Holman notes emphasize the suddenness and the oppressive nature of this exit. They had absolutely no time to let yeast ferment and dough rise.
They just grabbed whatever they had and ran.
Precisely. So by eating this specific bread every single year, you aren't just casually reading a history scroll to your children. You are physically tasting the panic,
Oh, wow.
the urgency, and the raw affliction of your ancestors. You are ingesting the memory. The crunch of the flatbread is a tactile reminder that your freedom was hard-won and sudden.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
The both study Bibles point out a pretty fascinating shift here. Back in Exodus chapter 12, when the original Passover happened, the people celebrated it in their own individual homes.
Right, the blood on the doorposts.
Exactly. They painted the blood on their own doorposts. But by the time we get to Deuteronomy 16, the mandate has completely changed. The text says you cannot sacrifice the Passover in any of your towns. You have to travel to a central sanctuary, quote, the place the Lord chooses.
That's a huge shift.
Yeah, why take this deeply intimate family practice out of the living room and force everyone to travel miles to a central hub?
Well, the Israelites are in a massive transition phase here. They are moving from a loosely connected group of wandering tribes into a settled agrarian nation in the Promised Land.
Okay.
When you disperse across a wide geographical area, there's a very real danger that your shared history will splinter into localized myths.
So everyone starts telling the story a little differently.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Centralizing the festival ensures the narrative remains unified. They gather as one people to remember one shared deliverance.
That's really smart. And the Holman study notes draw a really beautiful parallel here to the Christian tradition. They connect this ancient concept of the bread of affliction directly to the practice of the Lord's Supper, or communion.
The underlying mechanism of memory is remarkably similar. In both cases, you have a physical, sensory act of eating bread.
Right.
The ritual forces the participant to pause and physically engage with the profound cost of redemption. It prevents the historical event from becoming abstract theology. You taste it, you participate in it.
You step out of the present and into the story,
Mhm.
and bringing that past forward naturally dictates how they are instructed to treat people in the present.
Because empathy is the goal.
Yeah. If you have just spent a week eating flatbread and remembering that your ancestors were helpless slaves, you're probably going to look at the helpless people in your own neighborhood with a lot more empathy.
Memory in this text is absolutely designed to produce empathy.
Yeah.
And that empathy isn't just suggested, it is heavily legislated in the next phase of their calendar.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this next part actually tripped me up at first.
Uh-huh.
After Passover, the text moves to the harvest festivals, and Deuteronomy legally commands the people to rejoice. The phrasing in verses 11 and 14 is literally, "And you shall rejoice." How on earth do you legally mandate happiness? In an ancient agrarian society, your joy is entirely dependent on the weather.
A bad crop means starvation.
Exactly. So how do you mandate joy? Especially for the poorest people who have literally nothing to harvest.
You do it by building a radical social safety net directly into the economy of the festivals. Let's look at the timeline. After Passover in the spring, the text outlines the Feast of Weeks.
Okay.
In Judaism, this is Shavuot, which later connects to the Christian Pentecost. The Ennebilier notes explain the timing perfectly. It happens exactly 50 days, or 7 weeks, after the sickle is first put to the standing grain.
So Pentecost, coming from the Greek word for 50, is entirely tied to the first fruits of the wheat harvest.
Yes, the first wave of food comes in, and 50 days later, the entire community stops to celebrate. Then, fast forward to the autumn, so around September or October, you have the Feast of Tabernacles, also called Booths.
Right, the big one.
This is the massive final summer harvest. We're talking about the grapes and the olives. But the instruction for this festival is so fascinating. For 7 days, during the height of their agricultural wealth, the people were instructed to leave their comfortable homes and live outside in temporary shelters or booths.
Again with a sensory memory. You've just brought in your biggest, most lucrative harvest. You are feeling incredibly secure, and the law tells you to go sleep in a flimsy tent to remember the decades your ancestors spent wandering in the desert with nothing.
It shatters the illusion of self-sufficiency. It reminds them that everything they have harvested is a gift. And because it's a gift, they don't have the right to hoard it.
Which brings us to the guest list for these harvest festivals.
Right.
The guest list is revolutionary for the ancient world. It explicitly mandates the inclusion of male and female servants. It mandates the inclusion of the Levites, who were the priestly class that were deliberately given no land inheritance, so they had no crops of their own.
No way to feed themselves without the community.
Exactly. And crucially, it includes the foreigners, the orphans, and the widows living in their towns.
We're talking about the most deeply marginalized people in an ancient economy. People who literally owned no land, had no political power, and frankly had no economic reason whatsoever to celebrate a harvest.
But the law ensures that the joy of the harvest is entirely communal. You cannot truly rejoice before God if the orphan down the street is starving. The ancient Israelites figured out something modern economists still struggle with.
What's it?
You don't build a safety net merely on surplus. You build it into the actual rhythm of your life. The joy is legally mandated because the sharing is legally mandated.
And there is a brilliant economic equalizer attached to this. The text says no one should appear before the Lord empty-handed.
On the surface, that sounds a bit harsh, right? To demand an offering from someone who has very little.
It does, but the giving was strictly proportional. The instruction is that every person shall give as they are able according to the blessing they have received.
So it's not a flat tax, it's proportional sacrifice.
Ex-
If you had a bumper crop of olives and your storehouses are overflowing, your hands better be very full when you show up. But if you suffered a drought or you are a landless widow and you barely scraped by, your offering might be minuscule, but your seat at the festival table is just as secure.
The Holman study notes bring in a perfect New Testament parallel here with the story of the widow's mite.
Oh, I love that
Yeah,
story.
the wealthy are throwing large bags of gold into the temple treasury, but a poor widow puts in 2 tiny copper coins. Jesus observes this and declares that she gave more than all of them, because the wealthy gave out of their surplus, but she gave out of her poverty.
Wow.
Deuteronomy is establishing that very principle centuries earlier. The economic blueprint here values the proportional sacrifice over the raw wealth. It ensures that every single person, regardless of status, gets the dignity of participating in both the giving and the receiving.
So we have this vivid, almost utopian picture being painted. The community worshiping together, tasting their history of liberation, sitting in temporary tents, and feeding the marginalized.
It's a beautiful system.
It is. But tossing a feast for the poor 3 times a year is completely meaningless if those same vulnerable people are being robbed blind the other 364 days. You can't have economic joy without civic justice.
That's the reality check.
Right, which explains why the text suddenly pivots from the altar to the courtroom. So what does this all mean?
Well, worship without justice is fundamentally hollow in this worldview.
The text lays out guidelines for judges and officials in all the towns. The instructions are clear. Do not pervert justice, do not show partiality, and do not accept bribes.
Pretty standard stuff for us today.
Yeah, when I read this, my mind immediately went to our modern symbol of Lady Justice. You know, the statue holding the scales with the blindfold on. But I have to admit, I initially rolled my eyes a bit at this section.
Really? Why?
Well, isn't the law against accepting bribes painfully obvious? Like every functioning society knows bribery is bad. Why dedicate such premium real estate in this ancient text to tell judges not to take bribes, right after detailing these elaborate religious festivals?
It seems obvious to our modern sensibilities, sure, but we take the concept of blind justice for granted. In the ancient Near East, justice was frequently whatever the local king or the wealthy elite decided it was.
That makes sense.
Yeah, if you were wealthy, the cultural assumption was that the gods favored you, which meant you should win your court case against a poor person.
The wealth was seen as proof of your righteousness.
Exactly the opposite of what Deuteronomy is doing. The NDAA notes specify a profound theological shift here. In ancient Israel, civic justice and religious devotion were completely inseparable because human justice was supposed to derive directly from God's character.
Because God is perfectly just.
Right. Therefore, the local courts must be perfectly just, and you cannot separate how you treat your vulnerable neighbor in a property dispute from how you worship God at the festival.
And the language used to describe bribery is incredibly visceral. It says a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. It's framed almost like a physical toxin that enters the body politic.
A toxin that destroys the foundation of equality. If we connect this to the bigger picture, consider the power dynamics this text is establishing. The local judges, the officials, and later the kings themselves, they were not above the law.
Which was revolutionary.
Totally. In surrounding ancient cultures, the king was the ultimate source of the law. His word was final. But here, the leaders are deliberately placed under the authority of the word of God, the Torah.
They are subjects to the law, just like the poorest widow in the village.
It creates a radical precedent. True justice must be completely blind to wealth, status, and influence. The text summarizes this absolute pursuit with a ringing declaration in verse 20. Justice and only justice you shall pursue.
Not just when it's easy.
No, it doesn't say pursue justice when it's politically convenient, or pursue justice for the highest bidder, only justice. And the stakes are existential. The text tells them that their very survival, their ability to live and possess the land God is giving them, depends entirely on their fairness in the courts.
Yeah, which honestly makes the final verses of chapter 16 so incredibly baffling to me.
Oh, the transition.
Yes, I just can't wrap my head around this transition. We go from this soaring, majestic rhetoric about justice and only justice straight into what sounds like ancient zoning laws.
It does sound like that.
Verse 21 says, do not plant any wooden pole beside the altar of the Lord. And verse 22 says, do not set up a sacred stone. Are we seriously moving from the pinnacle of civic equity to landscaping advice? It feels like the text just tripped over itself.
This raises an important question, but I assure you it is definitely not landscaping advice. This abrupt shift addresses the single greatest threat to ancient Israel's entire architectural blueprint, syncretism.
Syncretism,
Yeah.
right? The blending together of different religious beliefs and practices.
Yes, pure justice requires pure devotion in this system. You cannot sustain a society based on the equitable justice of Yahweh if you are subtly downloading the values of the surrounding Canaanite cultures. Think of syncretism like a computer virus.
Okay, I like that analogy. How does that work in this context?
It's like downloading a new software program that looks incredibly helpful for managing your crops, but it carries a hidden malware that eventually corrupts your entire operating system of justice. The wooden pole the text warns against isn't just a tree,
What is it?
it's an Asherah pole. Asherah was a prominent Canaanite fertility goddess, and the sacred pillar, or obelisk, was widely associated with the worship of Baal, the Canaanite storm god.
Wait, so the Israelites were building an altar to Yahweh the God who just decimated the Egyptian empire and freed them from slavery, and then they were literally planting a tree for a local Canaanite fertility goddess right next to his altar.
Yes.
It sounds like they were hedging their bets.
That is precisely what was happening. Remember, they are transitioning into an agrarian lifestyle. They are entirely dependent on rain and fertile soil for their survival.
And Canaanite gods were all about weather and crops.
Exactly. The psychological temptation to appease the local fertility gods, the deities who supposedly controlled the weather in Canaan, was immense. And this isn't just a hypothetical warning from a paranoid author.
No, the Holman notes bring in some wild archaeological evidence here.
The evidence is staggering. Discoveries in the Negev region of Israel have unearthed ancient inscriptions and artifacts that prove some Israelites actually worshipped Yahweh alongside Asherah.
No way.
Yeah, they treated her as his consort or wife. They were fully assimilating the religious culture of the Canaanites into their own faith.
Wow, they really were running two completely incompatible operating systems at the same time.
Yeah.
But why is the text so fiercely opposed to this? Like, verse 22 states bluntly that the Lord hates these pillars. Why such strong language?
Because the Canaanite gods represented a completely different, deeply oppressive worldview.
Ah,
The Canaanite religious system routinely included the exploitation of the vulnerable, temple prostitution, and the heavy abuse of power by the elites. It was the exact opposite of the liberation and justice Yahweh had just mandated.
I see. You cannot claim to worship a God who strictly demands that you feed the orphan and the widow at your harvest table while simultaneously bowing down to a goddess from a culture that actively exploits those exact same people.
The two systems are violently incompatible. True worship cannot be divided because divided worship inevitably leads to divided justice.
That makes perfect sense.
If you pollute the altar with the symbols of exploitation, you will inevitably pollute the courtroom with the practices of exploitation. The purity of their devotion to Yahweh was the only anchor holding the equity of their society in place.
And if the anchor snaps,
The society drifts back into the very oppression they just escaped from in Egypt.
man, this has been an incredibly eye-opening journey through a single chapter of text. We are really looking at a comprehensive architecture for a society. We've seen an ancient people who literally built the concept of remembering into the physical sensory rhythm of their calendars.
Yeah, they baked their trauma into their food with the unleavened bread of affliction.
And they wove empathy into their economics with proportional giving and the radical inclusion of the poorest members of society. And they fiercely guarded this system with strict laws demanding blind justice in the courts and undivided loyalty at the altar.
It is a profound blueprint. It's a system that intimately recognizes human frailty. It anticipates our natural tendency to forget our past struggles, to hoard our wealth when we feel secure, to corrupt our courts with bribes, and to compromise our values when we are afraid.
The text builds guardrails against all of those human instincts,
It really does.
which leads us with a really provocative thought to chew on today. We aren't ancient Israelites living in an agrarian society depending on the autumn rains. But human nature really hasn't changed at all. We still forget, we still hoard, we still hedge our bets.
We do.
So what structures do we have in our modern, fast-paced, hyper-individualized lives to ensure we don't forget where we came from? What personal or societal rhythms do you practice that force you to stop, to physically remember your own past struggles, and to look around to intentionally share your joy with the vulnerable people in your communities? Are we just building insulated monuments to our own success, or are we actively building tables where the marginalized are invited to sit?
That is the lingering question this text leaves us with. The ancient blueprint for a just society is laid out clearly, but the application of those principles is entirely up to us.
It really is. Thank you so much for breaking down the history and the mechanisms behind this text with us today. To everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you some fascinating historical insights and some challenging questions to reflect on. As you go about your week, building your own rhythms and making your own choices, we want to say goodbye by declaring that God blesses all of you listeners. Take care of yourselves, and we'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.